Zachary Taylor was still an infant when his family left Virginia and moved to Louisville, Kentucky. Young Zachary grew up on his family's plantation and eventually joined the Kentucky militia. In 1808, Zachary Taylor began his long career in the U.S. Army, serving in the 7th Infantry Regiment. The future general steadily rose through the ranks. Taylor served in the War of 1812, Black Hawk War, and the Second Seminole War. Taylor gained the rank of commander of the 2nd Department of the Army's Western Division after his service in Florida. As annexation of Texas pressed forward, tensions with Mexico increased. In preparation of the impending conflict, Taylor took command of a U.S. garrison at Fort Jessup, Louisiana. Known as Old Rough and Ready, Zachary Taylor was a seasoned U.S. Army veteran by the time he led his men into Texas. Taylor's Army of Occupation encamped at Corpus Christi and then moved on to the banks of the Rio Grande. After some posturing by the U.S. and Mexican armies along the river banks, Taylor's army would hold their own against General Aristas' force on the prairie of Palo Alto. Taylor would go on to defeat the Mexican general the following day at Resaca de la Palma. The veteran U.S. general would continue his push into northern Mexico. He clashed with the Mexican army at Monterrey and captured the city after taking heavy losses. He would then battle the mercurial Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at Buena Vista and secure a victory there even though he was badly outnumbered. Zachary Taylor returned to the U.S. a war hero and rode the wave of popularity all the way to the White House. The 1848 election pitted Taylor against the Democratic candidate, Lewis Cass. Taylor's military service and his slaveholder status appealed to both Northern and Southern voters. Although he ran as a Whig candidate, Taylor did not commit firmly to party politics. Some Northerners were not pleased with the choice of Taylor and Cass. They were opposed to the extension of slavery to territories gained in the U.S. Mexican War and created third party in opposition, the Free Soil Party. The new party pulled enough votes from Cass to elect Taylor the 12th President of the United States. Sadly for Taylor, his term in office would be cut short. President Taylor became violently ill with a stomach ailment after attending 4th of July celebrations on the future grounds of the Washington Monument. While at the event, Taylor consumed large quantities of cherries and iced milk. His exact cause of death is still debated. Some believe it was a bout of severe gastroenteritis, while others believe it was cholera. President Zachary Taylor died on July 9, 1850. Zachary Taylor was an American military leader who served as the 12th President of the United States from 1849 until his death in 1850. Taylor was a career officer in the United States Army, rising to the rank of Major General and becoming a national hero for his victories in the Mexican-American War. As a result, he won election to the White House despite his vague political beliefs. His top priority as president was to preserve the Union. He died 16 months into his term from a stomach disease. Taylor was born into a prominent family of plantation owners who moved westward from Virginia to Louisville, Kentucky. In his youth, he was the last president born before the adoption of the Constitution. He was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army in 1808 and made a name for himself as a captain in the War of 1812. He climbed the ranks of the military, establishing military forts along the Mississippi River and entering the Black Hawk War as a colonel in 1832. His success in the Second Seminole War attracted national attention and earned him the nickname Old Rough and Ready. In 1845, during the annexation of Texas, President James K. Polk dispatched Taylor to the Rio Grande in anticipation of a battle with Mexico over the disputed Texas-Mexico border. The Mexican-American War broke out in April 1846, and Taylor defeated Mexican troops commanded by General Mariano Arista at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, driving Arista's troops out of Texas. Taylor then led his troops into Mexico, where they defeated Mexican troops commanded by Pedro de Ampudia at the Battle of Monterrey. Defying orders, Taylor led his troops further south and, despite being severely outnumbered, dealt a crushing blow to Mexican forces under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista. Taylor's troops were transferred to the command of Major General Winfield Scott, but Taylor retained his popularity. The Whig Party convinced a reluctant Taylor to lead its ticket in the 1848 presidential election, despite his unclear political tenets and lack of interest in politics. At the 1848 Whig National Convention, Taylor defeated Winfield Scott and former Senator Henry Clay for the party's nomination. He won the general election alongside New York politician Millard Fillmore, defeating Democratic Party nominees Lewis Cass and William Orlando Butler, as well as a third-party effort led by former President Martin Van Buren and Charles Francis Adams Sr. of the Free Soil Party. Taylor became the first president to be elected without having previously held political office. As president, he kept his distance from Congress and his cabinet, even though partisan tensions threatened to divide the Union. Debate over the status of slavery in the Mexican Cession dominated the national political agenda and led to threats of secession from Southerners. Despite being a Southerner and a slaveholder himself, Taylor did not push for the expansion of slavery, and sought sectional harmony above all other concerns. To avoid the issue of slavery, he urged settlers in New Mexico and California to bypass the territorial stage and draft constitutions for statehood, setting the stage for the Compromise of 1850. Taylor died suddenly of a stomach disease on July 9, 1850, with his administration having accomplished little aside from the ratification of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty and having made no progress on the most divisive issue in Congress and the nation, slavery. Vice President Fillmore assumed the presidency and served the remainder of his term. Historians and scholars have ranked Taylor in the bottom quartile of U.S. presidents, owing in part to his short term of office, 16 months, though he has been described as more a forgettable president than a failed one. Zachary Taylor, a general and national hero in the United States Army from the time of the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812, was elected the 12th U.S. president, serving from March 1849 until his death in July 1850. Northerners and Southerners disputed sharply whether the territories wrested from Mexico should be open to slavery, and some Southerners even threatened secession. Standing firm, Zachary Taylor was prepared to hold the Union together by armed force rather than by compromise. Born in Virginia in 1784, he was taken as an infant to Kentucky and raised on a plantation. He was a career officer in the Army, but his talk was most often of cotton raising. His home was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he owned a plantation in Mississippi. But Taylor did not defend slavery or Southern sectionalism. 40 years in the Army made him a strong nationalist. He spent a quarter of a century policing the frontiers against Indians. In the Mexican War he won major victories at Monterrey and Buena Vista. President Polk, disturbed by General Taylor's informal habits of command and perhaps his Whiggery as well, kept him in northern Mexico and sent an expedition under Gen. Winfield Scott to capture Mexico City. Taylor, incensed, thought that the Battle of Buena Vista opened the road to the city of Mexico and the halls of Montezuma, that others might revel in them. Old Rough and Ready's homespun ways were political assets. His long military record would appeal to Northerners, his ownership of 100 slaves would lure Southern votes. He had not committed himself on troublesome issues. The Whigs nominated him to run against the Democratic candidate, Lewis Cass, who favored letting the residents of territories decide for themselves whether they wanted slavery. In protest against Taylor the slaveholder and Cass the advocate of squatter sovereignty, Northerners who opposed extension of slavery into territories formed a Free Soil Party and nominated Martin Van Buren. In a close election, the Free Soilers pulled enough votes away from Cass to elect Taylor. Although Taylor had subscribed to Whig principles of legislative leadership, he was not inclined to be a puppet of Whig leaders in Congress. He acted at times as though he were above parties and politics. As disheveled as always, Taylor tried to run his administration in the same rule-of-thumb fashion with which he had fought Indians. Traditionally, people could decide whether they wanted slavery when they drew up new state constitutions. Therefore, to end the dispute over slavery in new areas, Taylor urged settlers in New Mexico and California to draft constitutions and apply for statehood, bypassing the territorial stage. Southerners were furious, since neither state constitution was likely to permit slavery. Members of Congress were dismayed, since they felt the president was usurping their policy-making prerogatives. In addition, Taylor's solution ignored several acute side issues: the northern dislike of the slave market operating in the District of Columbia, and the southern demands for a more stringent fugitive slave law. In February 1850, President Taylor had held a stormy conference with Southern leaders who threatened secession. He told them that if necessary to enforce the laws, he personally would lead the army. Persons taken in rebellion against the Union, he would hang, with less reluctance than he had hanged deserters and spies in Mexico. He never wavered. Then events took an unexpected turn. After participating in ceremonies at the Washington Monument on a blistering July 4, Taylor fell ill. Within 5 days he was dead. After his death, the forces of compromise triumphed, but the war Taylor had been willing to face came 11 years later. In it, his only son Richard served as a general in the Confederate Army. Zachary Taylor was born on November 24, 1784 in Virginia, but his family moved shortly thereafter to Louisville, Kentucky. He was raised on a plantation called Springfield, surrounded by enslaved laborers owned by his father Richard. Taylor received a basic education and aspired from a young age to join the military. He enlisted at the age of 22 and became an officer in the United States Army in 1808. 2 years later he returned to marry Margaret Mackle Smith, and 5 of their 6 children were born at Springfield. For the next 25 years, Taylor spent most of his time policing the nation's borderlands. He fought many military campaigns against Native Americans and served at garrison posts throughout the country. He also owned and operated plantations in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Rodney, Mississippi. Hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children labored at the properties to sustain the large Taylor family. Taylor gained national prominence after he won a series of major military victories during the Mexican-American War. Despite being outnumbered by Mexican forces, Taylor's defeat of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista cemented his status as a military hero and prepared him for the American political stage. Turning away from Whig leader and 3-time presidential candidate Henry Clay, the party nominated Old Rough and Ready for the 1848 presidential election, hoping to imitate the same success it had with William Henry Harrison in 1840. Taylor appealed to Northerners as a military leader and avowed nationalist. His status as a slave owner was attractive to Southern voters, and he had avoided controversial issues as a political outsider. Taylor ran against Democratic candidate Lewis Cass, who supported self-determination of territories over whether they would support slavery. Whigs who opposed Taylor's candidacy, along with anti-slavery Democrats who rejected Cass's idea of popular sovereignty, decided to form the Free Soil Party to oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories. The party nominated former President Martin Van Buren, who secured just enough votes to undermine Cass and deliver the election to Taylor. One of the main issues during the Taylor presidency were the lands acquired from the victory in the Mexican-American War. Northerners and Southerners sharply disagreed over whether the territories wrested from Mexico should be open to slavery. Although Taylor subscribed to Whig principles of legislative leadership, he did not blindly support Whig leaders in Congress. While he attempted to remain above the political fray, Taylor personally did not support the expansion of slavery. Still, his political goals and private actions did not always align. Despite his opposition to slavery's expansion, Taylor remained a slave owner for the rest of his life, profiting from the labor of hundreds of enslaved people who lived and worked on his plantations. President Taylor was surrounded by enslaved valets, cooks, and maids in the executive mansion. He also continued to manage his Cypress Grove plantation from afar. Though little documentation survives today, some enslaved individuals who likely served at the White House include Charles Porter, Tom, Dicey, Jane, William, and Caroline. Click here to learn more about the enslaved households of President Zachary Taylor. Unsatisfied with the ideas proposed by Congress, Taylor urged settlers in New Mexico and California to draft constitutions and apply for statehood, therefore bypassing the territorial stage. If that solution did not work, Taylor was prepared to take decisive action. In February 1850, he held a conference with Southern leaders who had threatened secession. Taylor told them that, if necessary to enforce the laws, he would personally lead the army. Persons taken in rebellion against the Union, he would hang. With less reluctance than he had hanged deserters and spies in Mexico. The debate continued to embroil territorial government officials, abolitionists, and citizens. In 1850, members of Congress labored to negotiate a grand compromise between factions. That 4th of July, President Taylor participated in ceremonies at the Washington Monument. After the event, Taylor became violently sick. On July 9, 1850, he died of a gastrointestinal illness at the White House. After his death, the forces of compromise triumphed, but the war Taylor had been willing to fight came 11 years later. Because of his short tenure, Taylor is not considered to have strongly influenced the office of the presidency or the United States. Some historians believe that he was too inexperienced with politics at a time when officials needed close ties with political operatives. Despite his shortcomings, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty affecting relations with Great Britain in Central America is recognized as an important step in scaling down the nation's commitment to manifest destiny as a policy. Historical rankings of presidents of the United States have generally placed Taylor in the bottom quarter. Taylor was the last president to own slaves while in office. He was the third of 4 Whig presidents, the last being Fillmore, his successor. Taylor was also the second president to die in office, preceded by William Henry Harrison, who died while serving as president 9 years earlier. Thank you for watching this video.